Third part. The first thing Dee did was tell Vera and Lurie to hide. At that point, there was an unexpected development. Vera, the brave doctor, started crying in fear. "No, I don't want to be left here with the child," she cried. "What are we supposed to do if the monsters come? Can you take responsibility for that?"
"Wow."
The hunter's left hand groaned.
"That's how the cookie crumbled? The physical and mental shift brought on by external pressure. Just perfect."
Even Lurie couldn't help but ask, "Dr. Vera, what's wrong?" "Shut up. Just stay out of this. My life is at stake." Vera cried, even raising her hand as if to slap the boy. "What are you going to do?" the dumbfounded Lilia whispered to Dee. She hadn't yet exhibited any of the effects of being bitten by him. It was just as if it had been when Gilzen bit her. "If she keeps crying and screaming like that, she's going to dig her own grave. The kid's in danger too," she added. "Of course, you know full well if we bring them along, they'll only get in our way." Lilia licked her lips. In a low, dark, passionate tone she continued, "How about we kill them?" Looking her straight in the face, Dee said, "You're hungry, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. It was merely an observation. However, Lilia's expression changed. Who'd ever... Not for her blood. The huntress spat with naked loathing. But she quickly got a look in her eyes that was beyond description as she stared at Dee. It was a feverish gaze. "Funny, isn't it? When Gilzen bit me, it was no big deal. But I look at you, and it makes me all warm south of the border. You know, Dee, you're the one who did this to me. Sure you don't want to take responsibility?" Her words could have been interpreted in several very different ways, but of course there was no reply. This was no time for worrying about such things. After a short pause, Dee told her, "You're staying here, too." Lilia bugged her eyes, sputtering, Why?" "Hide somewhere and wait for me to come back." "I think just doing away with them would be faster. After all, it's not like bringing them back was part of the contract." At that point, Lilia noticed how Dee was looking at her. "Stop it," she cried. "You're giving me the creeps." "Fine. I'll look after these two. Now hurry back. One more thing. Are you sure you can find Gilzen without me?"
"We'll manage somehow,"
the hoarse voice replied in distaste. Ignoring it, Lilia got closer to Dee, grabbed his hand, and gave it a small but intense shake. "You'd better come back." It was unclear whether or not Dee noticed her words weren't prompted by concern for his safety. "We'll be hiding out somewhere on this floor," she continued. "Give a shout if you make it back." "There are 3 types of enemy here. Be careful," Dee said. Gilzen and those loyal to him, the aliens, and now the monsters the noble had created. That made 3 threats. Regardless of the fact that Lilia had received the kiss of the nobility, those weren't the kind of foe she could easily best. Once the hunter had stepped out into the corridor, his left hand asked,
"Okay, where are we going?"
"The energy core," Dee said without missing a beat.
"Oh," That's a good plan. Threaten to destroy the whole castle, and will have no choice but to show himself. And we know where the reactor is. But on the way there, the place is liable to be crawling with monsters. Can't say for sure none of them aren't tough enough to slay you.
Because its sarcastic remark was finished, the hunter said, "Where is it?"
That away.
Dee started walking. No matter what form of terrors this insane world might have waiting for him out there, they would never stop this gorgeous young man from pressing forward. Daybreak. The stony moving sidewalk was going down a steep incline. An hour had passed since the hunter had entrusted the others to Lilia's care.
Sheesh.
The hoarse voice croaked.
You've done well to make it this far. You've really hacked your way through those hellish guardians. Today you've really got me thinking you're a monster.
The voice sounded rather reflective, but there was no response from Dee. A ghastly sight. He kept his silence. His right shoulder had been split open by the lightning-quick assault of a spiked tail, leaving his upper body soaked in blood. His left cheek bore a shallow cut the flesh was rising to fill, but initially it had been deep enough to expose his cheekbone. That wound had been dealt by one of the meatball-shaped carnivores that had flown at him by the hundreds. His left hand had been taken off twice, and was now finally reattaching itself. Just to get this far, he must have slain more than 50 monsters. Yet the young man was exquisite. Stained with darkness and blood, his pale skin glowing all the more, his stunning good looks were such that they might even be described as hellishly beautiful. And it seemed like they would drive the whole world mad. And everyone who looked upon his face felt the same thing. I don't mind if he kills me. It wasn't a thought. That faculty quickly melted away, and wouldn't return for a while. Every foe of his was enraptured, and being slain in such a state, they probably all died happy. Dee stepped off onto the stone pathway. A stone doorway towered before him. It was massive in comparison to all the doors he'd seen up to this point, and an overwhelming force filled the stonework. It was terribly quiet.
Security's gonna be brutal,
the hoarse voice warned him. Dee had already started forward. Whatever awaited him, it didn't matter to this young man.
You need a key to open the lock,
the hoarse voice said, sounding composed, considering the context. It must have been used to situations like this. Dee pressed his left hand against the stone doorway. At the same time, the door behind him began to open.
Wow, it actually worked.
The left hand cried out, and Dee lowered it, watching the receding door in the slowly widening rectangle.
This is a trap. Gilson set it up because he guessed we'd come in here. Hey, you still planning on going in?
That could be called a dumb question. Not waiting until it was sufficiently wide to pass through, Dee twisted his body to squeeze through the doorway.
Oh my.
That remark escaped the hunter's left hand on seeing the armed soldiers in the space just beyond the door. Equipped with long spears, long bows, rifles, flamethrowers, and even laser guns, the soldiers numbered over 100. These were the troops who guarded the energy core.
Just as I thought,
the hoarse voice said, a sigh mixing with its words. Yet, why did its tone also carry confidence, and bold laughter. The soldiers arrayed there already had eyes glowing red with madness, and a colorless and invisible but nonetheless incredibly powerful air of the supernatural rose from them. At the fore stood a row of 10 soldiers armed with laser guns. "Take aim," ordered the apparent leader, standing at the right end of the row. Without a second to lose, he continued, "Fire." It didn't seem likely even Dee could survive being shot through the heart by a 10,000-degree heat ray. However, no deadly beams were fired. As the shaken soldiers broke their line, a black gale rushed at them. Silvery gleams flashed out, and blood spurted horribly, while the blue light was witness to the chaos of life and death. Those who discarded their laser guns and tried to run away had their backs slashed open, while those who tried to shield themselves with the guns were cut in two, along with their weapons. The vampire hunter Dee, baring your teeth at him, was a knock at death's door. "Don't get near him. Encircle him and hit him with the arrows," shouted the leader, whose face was then split down the middle. The bowmen receded like an outgoing tide. Before they could stop, the black gale blew at them, dropping them in a storm of blood. Dee's blade didn't deal shallow wounds. It was as if the Grim Reaper had whispered to him that making them suffer would be a sin, and the soldiers who fought in the retreat joined the bloody festivities through their instantaneous deaths. Long spears thrust at the hunter from all 4 sides. Hoping to deal the final blow to the impaled hunter, the group with the long swords made a ring and waited for their chance. Before they realized it was merely an afterimage the spears had pierced, and the spearmen were on the receiving end of the murderous intent from the beauty in black, sailing down from above. By the time 100 soldiers had been reduced to half that number, their fear was so high many of them tried to flee. Some were pierced through the heart by rough wooden needles, and some reached the exit at the far end of the room. Thudding into an invisible barrier, they fell on the spot with hands up to their faces, and still more needles assailed them. The existence of that barrier filled the soldiers with despair and rebellion. They counterattacked with looks of insanity on their faces, but they were quickly cut down and reduced to dust. Not even breathing hard, Dee had just lowered his sword when a heavy laugh rained down on him from above. Dee looked up. Gilson stood atop the canopy that covered a walkway that ran to the far end of the room. The expression, "no blood or tears," describes you quite well, doesn't it? In order to talk with me, you cut down 100 men without getting winded. Well, that's fine. Fighting is their job. They must realize that losing means dying. So, on to the next part. "The next part," the hoarse voice said, furrowing its brow. Dee felt the space on all sides of him suddenly grow tighter. "Shrinking down your force field?" the hoarse voice asked, and for some reason there was laughter in its tone. "It's a gravity field, to be precise," Gilson said, "and I shall squeeze you down until you're small enough to fit through a hole in the Dirac Sea. I wonder how a false immortal will react when he has infinite negative mass and infinitely small volume." It was said that unless a vampire had a stake driven through their heart or their head cut off, they would continue to live. Numerous examples attested to this. Even now scholars in the capital pondered the destruction of vampires. Are there any other ways to do it? They wondered. Drowning, burning, bullets being run over, asphyxiation, sudden impact, blood loss, etc., etc. They scour the written records, oral traditions, and first-hand accounts from frontier villages. Laboriously cataloging the roughly 30,000 examples that they divided into the aforementioned classes in Deaths of the Nobility, in which the author directs or so had this to say. The sole manner of death for which we have no records at all is death by pressure. Nobles take great pride in their unchanging elegance and youth, but if one were to be locked in a square chamber, and pressure were applied from all sides until flesh and bone were fused together, would the noble still be able to return to normal? I am extremely curious and excited about the prospect of witnessing such an experiment. Now, walls of electrons pressed against every inch of D, resulting in an unpleasant sound of creaking bones in a place so sealed off no one would hear it. Chapter 5, End.